Good evening. Thank you for joining us for a deeper dive into examining questions from So You Want to Talk About Race with Nikki McCord, part of Boulder Public Library's One Book One Boulder. One Book One Boulder is a new program set to bring Boulder together through the shared experience of reading and discussing the same book. This year's selection is So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. A broad range of programs are taking place from late July to November, supporting community members in learning, reflecting, and taking action on the topic of racial equity. Many of these events, including this one, are recorded and available on the Boulder Public Library's YouTube channel. I am Kathy Lane, Programs, Events, and Outreach Coordinator with the Boulder Public Library. I recognize my privilege as a white, cisgendered, educated woman. With me on stage is Nikki McCord, who is facilitating tonight's program and whom I will introduce in a moment. Shannon Kincaid and Julianne Ingram and Terja Becker are managing the broadcast behind the scenes. So although we are joining together from the comfort of our own homes, I want to honor that the City of Boulder stands on the land of Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute. To find out more about land acknowledgements and ways you can support equity and rights of Indigenous people, please visit the links in the chat. Thank you to the Boulder Library Foundation, which sponsors 90% of Boulder Public Library programs and events, including One Book One Boulder. I invite you to consider joining the foundation at boulderlibraryfoundation.org. And please be advised, library conduct guidelines apply to online events. Visit boulderlibrary.org for these, as well as tips on internet safety and privacy. Now, for One Book One Boulder, we have specific group norms, which guide our behavior in addition to general library guidelines. You'll be invited to make comments and ask questions. And if you identify as Black, Indigenous, or person of color, we invite you to put an asterisk before your questions and comments so we can be sure to give marginalized voices a chance to speak and be heard. Please approach this conversation with a growth mindset and give grace. A growth mindset says, I don't know everything, and I have room in my development for growth. To the best of your ability, ask questions that will lead to your own greater understanding while also making sure to leave space for others to speak, share, and understand. Ask yourself if you are stereotyping, underestimating, or insulting a fellow community member. When listening, give others grace. We will all stumble and make mistakes as we grow. And finally, no racist statements or slurs will be tolerated. No hate speech will be tolerated. People who identify as Black, Indigenous people of color will speak about their lived experiences as needed. So tonight, I am pleased to welcome Nikki McCord as a facilitator, guiding us on a deeper dive into examining questions from So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. Nikki McCord is the founder of McCord Consulting Group, a full-service consulting firm specializing in facilitation and training in areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, board of director governance, and strategic facilitation. A former lobbyist, Nikki has a wealth of experience bringing together disparate groups for a common purpose in a supportive manner. She earned her bachelor degree from the University of Notre Dame and received her master's degree at Michigan State University. Nikki is a public speaker, speaking before audiences at the Financial Planning Association, Expo West, the Colorado Small Business Development Center, and the University of Notre Dame. So tonight, this will be an interactive experience, responding to situations that Nikki will offer to the group tonight. And Nikki will explain we have two special guest volunteers who will be participating in our journey. So thank you to all of you for your bravery, vulnerability to be on screen and in the chat, grappling with challenging situations dealing with racism. We are together with you on the journey. We expect there to be some time at the end to ask questions about tonight's conversation in Ijeoma's book, So You Want to Talk About Race, while we are live on YouTube and Facebook. Reminder, if you identify as BIPOC, please add an asterisk before your question or comment. And if you would like to carry on the conversation, we invite you to join us next week, Thursday at 7 o'clock for a conversation with the author, Ijeoma Oluo. We will do our best to answer your questions tonight in the available time and encourage you to take the conversation further. Thank you for listening, and over to you, Nikki.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen so that we can go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Nikki McCord. It's my pleasure to lead you through this thought exercise developed after reading So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. I've invited two participants, Charlotte and Allison, to join this journey. And there they are. Hi, Charlotte. Hi, Allison. The Boulder Public Library asked for volunteers to participate in this presentation, and they answered the call. I've never met them, and the questions we will explore together have not been shared with them in advance. Racism is sly. It hits you unexpectedly. You could be listening to a lecture in class, or sitting with colleagues in a team meeting, or talking to a neighbor about the weather, and boom, a racist comment is said, or microaggression is lobbed. You weren't prepared. You don't know how to react or what to say. Over the next few minutes, my new friends, Charlotte, Allison, and I, are going to role play how we would react in a variety of scenarios. And I invite you to role play with us as well. So take some time, go grab a pen, piece of paper, and jot down your answers as we go along. Now, before we begin, I need to make a few things clear. First of all, this exercise is not meant to embarrass anyone. Our volunteers are being vulnerable by reacting to situations in real time. I'm going to give them 1 minute, 30 seconds to answer each question before we move on. I have my trusty timer here, and they'll hear a very nice sound when the minute 30 is over. Remember, we are all learning together, and this is not the time to judge anyone's reaction. Secondly, the next few minutes are going to be uncomfortable, and we're going to learn some things about ourselves. The point of this exercise is to give you confidence and tools to unapologetically advocate for marginalized people so that we can all prosper in a just society. Are you ready, Charlotte? Are you ready, Allison?
Yeah. Ready.
Excellent. Let's get started. Thanksgiving Day is right around the corner. Now, Thanksgiving may look different in 2020 due to COVID-19, but let's pretend that there isn't a pandemic outdoors. Let's pretend that you are gathering with your family over a Thanksgiving meal. Many of us were taught as children that Thanksgiving is a holiday that celebrates the Pilgrims and Indigenous people coming together to share food and fellowship. This is a white-centered idea that erases the Indigenous people who inhabited this land long before the colonizers arrived. We're going to place on the screen some resources about the origins of what we now celebrate at Thanksgiving. I invite you to use Thanksgiving dinner as an opportunity to challenge the legitimacy of white-centered education. So let's begin with our volunteers. I'm going to give you 1 minute 30 to answer. So first, Allison, what can you do to center Indigenous voices during Thanksgiving?
That's a great question. I think it's an opportunity to talk about the sort of the origins of what people in the United States think of as Thanksgiving, and how that it was not a nonviolent celebration, that it was and it was truly it was a rape of the Indigenous populations and sort of takeover of Indigenous populations. And I think at Thanksgiving, it's an opportunity to recognize that that takeover.
Great answer, Allison. To add on to what you're saying, what's very interesting and what's great about this type of discussion is we have time. So we have time before Thanksgiving now. There was a resource that was placed on your screen. It's an article about the origins of Thanksgiving. There's our nice little sound saying that our minute 30 is over. But I would encourage you, now that you know that there is other history out there, to do a Google search, do some reading. Maybe at the start of the Thanksgiving dinner, you can take some time and remember whose land that we inhabit. Maybe you can read the story of the true origins of Thanksgiving around the table, assuming that COVID doesn't exist. But to educate yourself and to educate others as well. Thank you, Allison, for that answer. Charlotte, the next question is for you. What other history have you been taught that is white-centered and has a different meaning to marginalized communities?
A lot. So it's, of course, hard to pinpoint one when that question comes up, but I think a lot of times, you know, when we talk about the Civil War, it's like, oh, well, there were a bunch of other factors and slavery wasn't the main point. That's definitely something that I heard growing up, which is obviously can be pretty offensive and really harmful to the people that were harmed by that institution. I think that's a main one that comes up for me. I think overall, just, you know, hearing now, it's so cool to be able to hear stories on Facebook and on Instagram and all over the internet and do research about that. But it's just a lot of people that I feel like why did I never know about them is kind of the feeling that I get having gone through a pretty white-centered education and lived in a white-centered society in my life. So I'm glad to continue learning about just kind of people that for some reason I feel like were never mentioned. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that answer. You're absolutely right, Charlotte. I encourage everyone to question everything. We have Google now, which is fantastic. We can always type something into Google and ask, what did other people think about it? You may also want to take some time to, if you're hearing a history or a story from one side or the other, do some research on what did the other side think? How were they impacted? I think those are really great examples of ways that we can get rid of our white-centered education and learn more about what other groups thought, felt, said about our history. All right, we're going to move on to the next question, and both of you are going to answer this question. So it's the same question for both of you. And I'm going to start with Charlotte since I started with Allison the last time. So here we go. What are microaggressions? This is a chapter in the book. So the goal of a microaggression is to normalize racism. Microaggressions make racist assumptions a part of everyday life. So here's our scenario. We're still sitting down at Thanksgiving dinner, and your mother asks the following: why can't Blacks and Latinos be like Asians and Jews? They never asked for any handouts, and look how well they fit into American society. Charlotte, knowing what you now know about microaggressions, how do you respond?
Wow. I can imagine that happening at family dinner and kind of like sucking in my breath, just like I did as you ask this, because even for somebody who's white, that comment kind of hurts. I don't know, slaps that that our white culture has, I guess, normalized that certain behaviors or traits are idealized, whereas others are not. And I'm also thinking about the chapter in this book on model minorities and how kind of holding up different minority groups is a tool that's really divisive, and something that actually harms all people, because it creates some very narrow channels in which people are able to exist, and that, by holding anybody as like a group rather than being able to see some of the individuals, and by holding certain traits as kind of holy or ideal, it can mask the struggles that have occurred within those groups or do occur within those groups. Yeah.
Great answer, Charlotte, and right on time. Allison, I'm going to ask you the same question.
Yeah, and it would be incredibly tough to be at the Thanksgiving table and hear that. One, I think there's, each group certainly has a different history and background and culture. I don't know. I don't know how I would respond to that. Sorry, I don't have a more robust answer for that.
That's absolutely fine, and I appreciate you being honest, Allison. This is exactly what I said at the beginning of the presentation. Racism hits you in the face, and you're like, what is happening? How do I respond? So let's take a few moments to think about this question and how we would respond. Charlotte brought up the chapter on the model minority. And that chapter talks a lot about how when you elevate certain groups, you also don't look at the disparities within those groups as well. And so in terms of what type of response you would make, I would go back to the book, I would read that chapter about model minority and use that as an example to say, well, all groups have had very different experiences in this country. And I don't think that it's fair for us to pit one group against another. That's very divisive. Instead of saying that Blacks and Latinos aren't like Asians and Jews, maybe we should look at ways that we can elevate all people so we can all be on an equal and just playing level. So that could be one way to respond to a microaggression like this. The other thing that I want to point out is what we saw in the book. Microaggressions are an opportunity to make racism every day. And so if we are going to speak like this and say Blacks and Latinos need to be like Asians and Jews, we are normalizing this piece of racism. And so that can be another response as well. This is a microaggression. We want to get rid of racism. We don't want to normalize it. Let's learn a little bit more and remove this from our way of thinking. Excellent responses. Thank you so much. All right, we're going to move on to the next one. And Allison, you'll be going first. So on page 205 of the book, Ms. Oluo defines tone policing in the following way. Tone policing is when someone, usually the privileged person, in a conversation or situation about oppression, shifts the focus of the conversation from the oppression being discussed to the way it is being discussed. So let's look at our scenario. During Thanksgiving dinner, your brother says he's all for Black Lives Matter, but they would get their point across better if they didn't loot and riot. Destroying businesses is not going to get people to listen to them. They need to be peaceful, like the protesters of the 1960s. Allison, how would you respond to your brother, knowing what you now know about tone policing?
Well, I think I would respond to him that the way that Black Lives Matter protesters are responding is not necessarily the point. The Black Lives Matter protests are about protesting the injustices that are happening today and in the past for people of color, and many of the people that are looting and rioting are not necessarily part of the Black Lives Matter, but I think the way that people are protesting, many people have protested in the past peacefully and not necessarily seen results. And so, this is today's Black Lives Matter protests are taking a different form. Some peaceful, and some derivations of the movements have experienced some violence. But you can certainly understand the anger, though you may not agree with the means. But the main point is that they're protesting the unjust actions that are occurring today.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that response, Allison. I'm going to just reset my timer here. All right, Charlotte, how would you respond to your brother knowing what you know now about tone policing?
Thanks for going first, Allison. That extra minute helped. I think what I would honestly, my first reaction was just that's not necessarily true that the 1960s didn't see violence, right? I think that's part of, going back to the first question, white-centered education that we learned, and that there was violence that occurred, especially against Black people and protesters. So that's, I think, maybe the first place that I would start, not only because that's the thing that grips me and I kind of have a reaction to, but because that's maybe the jumping off point. And I actually talked with some coworkers about this book today, and we talked a lot about the tone policing chapter and just how it's not necessarily just about one instance. It's about the your whole life, and how that's maybe some violence and oppression that's been happening in your whole life. And if you think about things that maybe make you lose your cool, right? It could be a bad day and you just, the kitchen's dirty and that makes you lose your cool. And so I think there's a point at which we look at protesters, or as a white person, I might say, oh, that's too brutal, that's too extreme. But I know that some days I'm just having a bad day and I lose my cool, but I'm still a human. That's okay. We can lose our cool. We can show our anger in different ways. And so why do I put those standards on somebody else who's experienced a lifetime of expression? But I say oh, the way you're doing that is, I don't have any empathy for you because I don't like how you're expressing your anger. Yeah.
Excellent.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing your answers. So thank you both to Allison and Charlotte for sharing your answers. This chapter is about tone policing. And what I think is really important to get across to folks is, just because you don't like the way someone is doing something doesn't negate the message that they have. And so I would refocus people to what the message is. What is Black Lives Matter doing? They are protesting the police brutality against Black people and people of color in this country. I would get people to start talking about how do you imagine we change these systems so that Black Lives Matter doesn't have to protest at all? Remember that with tone policing, the idea is not to attack the cause. It's to attack the way that the cause is being presented. And so as you go through these discussions, as you hear these things from colleagues, people in your circle, people who you come across, you'll be able to identify, oh, this is a tone policing situation. And so let's actually break this down as to what it is to hopefully educate folks. Excellent. Thank you so much for those answers. All right, Charlotte, you're up next. So this chapter is called, I Just Got Called Racist, What Do I Do Now? So in this chapter, we learn that we like to think of our own character in the same way that it will be written in our obituaries. On your journey to become anti-racist, you will make mistakes. You may even be called racist, and no one wants the word racist associated with them in their obituary. Now on page 220, Ms. Oluo gives the reader a process to follow after being called out for racist statements or actions. So Charlotte and Allison, let's explore a not so hypothetical situation. And I'll have you guys pay attention because I'm going to play a video.
That showed up. Some residents voiced concerns about traffic, others about overcrowding in their schools.
Hi, nice to meet you.
And some were worried about having low-income housing in their neighborhood.
Why did you pick this spot?
Nicole Humphrey is a local opponent of the development.
What is your concern when it comes to Section 8 and low income?
The lifestyle I feel like that goes with Section 8 is usually working maybe single moms or people who are struggling to keep their heads above water. And it's not, I feel so bad saying that, but it's not, it's just not people who are, I guess, of the same class as us, which sounds bad, but I don't mean that in a bad way.
Some people would say, look, they maybe have not had the opportunities that their kids are not going to have the opportunities that your kids are going to have in this neighborhood.
Right.
Can they share in that?
The problem with that is I hear a lot of the unfair of, oh, we haven't been given this or not that, or we haven't been afforded things that you might have been afforded. I don't look at multimillionaires and think, why don't I have a yacht? Why don't I have a private jet? It's a mindset, I feel like.
Do you think that you maybe are stereotyping the folks?
Oh, I totally am. 100%. It's not, it works both ways. I'm definitely not a racist and I'm not bigot, but I think I hold a little bit of a stigma against people who are different. We don't want nomads. We don't want people who don't have roots. I just don't want that to be what my community is about.
You guys got some extra time because I was trying to figure things out. But let's read what Nicole said again. So let's imagine the situation. During Thanksgiving dinner, your cousin says this. The lifestyle that goes with Section 8 is usually working single moms or people who are struggling to keep their heads above water. I feel so bad saying that. We don't want nomads. We don't want people who don't have roots. I just don't want that to be what my community is about. So Charlotte, armed with the information on page 220 or any information that you have, how do you respond to your cousin?
I read the audiobook, so I don't have that in front of me, unfortunately, because I know it was such a nice list. And I should go back in my notes and look at that exact list.
Then don't even think about the list, Charlotte.
Yeah, I know. Just how would I react? I'm picturing a cousin too. I don't know if that's helpful or unhelpful. I think I'd say, that people who are struggling or are single parents aren't necessarily adding negative things to your community, or like maybe I would say, oh, it seems like you have some negative perceptions in people who have Section 8 housing, but like your mom was a single mom and like sometimes we've been struggling to keep our heads above water, but like I feel like, we love being family, we love each other, you're a great person. So maybe these people that are different from you, even if they don't have roots, or even if they are somebody you might consider nomads, they might add something really great to your community, even if it makes you uncomfortable because you don't know them yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess that's where I'd start.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that answer. I'm going to restart my timer, and I'm going to ask you, Allison, how do you respond to your cousin who says this over Thanksgiving dinner?
And similarly, I returned my book to the Boulder Library a few weeks ago. So thank you, Boulder Library, for providing it. But I do think it's important to call out that this is a comment that is stereotypical, and I think using the word racist, I think puts white people generally really back on their heels. So I wouldn't use that word, but I would say, you're grouping everyone, you're grouping people that use Section 8 into one group of people. They're not necessarily all single moms. They're not necessarily nomads. These could be people who, are struggling through a hard time and you need to utilize this service for a time in their lives. I think that's an oversimplification to consider that all people are what you're classifying as Section 8. So I guess I would think it would be important to call out the grouping of the people that are in Section 8.
Excellent. Thank you, Allison, for that. Thank you for that answer. One of the things that stuck out to me about this exchange was this idea that people are coveting what other people have. People are coveting education. People are coveting upward mobility. One of the responses that I have to this situation is, while the woman in this video says that she doesn't look at multimillionaires and ask, why doesn't she have a yacht? But she is interested in bettering her life and bettering the lives of her children. And why should one group of people be afforded that opportunity for upward mobility while another group of people is not afforded that opportunity for upward mobility? The other thing that strikes me about this video is how precarious any one of our situations are. She speaks about single moms and how, people who are moving in are single moms. Whether you're married, if you're married and have children, you could be a single mom at the drop of a hat without you knowing it. And so to pass judgment on people and their lifestyles when you could very well be in a situation like that yourself is very short-sighted. I know that folks don't want to be called racist, but one of the things that Ms. Oluo says in the book is that we cannot discount the feelings or the harm that people cause by being racist and ignore the fact that they are indeed being racist. Now, when I started this, I believe I said this on this video, we're all going to respond to these situations in our own manner, and that's absolutely okay. Not everyone is outspoken. Not everyone is a line leader. We're all going to react in the way that makes the most sense to us. And so whether that is using the word racist or not using the word racist, whatever feels authentic to you is how you should approach these situations, as long as you are approaching these situations in a way to eradicate these stigmas and these stereotypes and move us to a more just society. I have some time left. Let's do a gut check. How are you feeling, Charlotte? How are you feeling, Allison?
Learning a lot. Very good.
Charlotte,
yeah.
Nervous to have these conversations in public, but I really appreciate the opportunity to learn.
Excellent. Should we forge ahead? Let's forge ahead. Who answered that one first last time?
I started on this one.
You started. Okay,
I'm
Allison.
just feeling prepared for Thanksgiving, Nikki. This is good.
Here's our next scenario. This is going to be another video.
And we appreciated it. And again, one thing we've seen in a lot of the Black community, which is mostly Democrat, is that President Trump's policies are the policies that can help people break out of the problems that they're complaining about, but he can't want them to be successful more than they want to be successful. And what you're seeing throughout
Okay, that was really quick. So I'm going to read it. And who's going first? Allison, you're going first. So I'm giving you a little bit more time. So Jared Kushner this week, I believe it was this week, says, and again, one thing we've seen in a lot of the Black community, which is mostly Democrat, is that President Trump's policies are the policies that can help people break out of the problems that they're complaining about. But he can't want them to be he can't want them to be successful more than they want to be successful. Jared showed up at your Thanksgiving dinner, Allison, and he said this. Armed with the information that you have from the chapter, I just got called racist, what do I do now? Or any of the other chapters in the book, how are you going to respond to your relative, Jared, at Thanksgiving?
Well, I have a lot of issues with this statement, certainly. But I think he's saying President Trump can't want them to be successful more than they want to be successful. I mean, I think it is a huge assumption. It implies that it implies that people of color are not they're not striving, that they're not taking advantage of opportunities that are being given to them, and it's very offensive. I'm not sure exactly how I'd respond.
It's a tough one. I agree. Thanks for your honesty, Allison. Let me start my timer again. All right, Charlotte, you're up.
Okay, so reflecting on my answer to the last one, I think I'd start by naming, like, that sounds like a stereotype that I might say something like could be considered racist, depending on which cousin I'm talking to. Uncouch it a little bit. And that it's blaming Black people for struggling or for having, like specifically maybe socioeconomic struggles. And especially in this case, it's talking about with some policies or programs that are happening now, but we can't just undo, 400 plus years of inequalities with a couple social programs or with a couple, business grants or something like that. And so saying that blaming Black people for not being successful is what I take away from this statement, which I do not think is fair, especially given the history that kind of ignores. And today's reality too, I might go into say like things about incarceration rates and how that really ruins people's chances at employment and how that has been pushed unfairly on our communities of color.
Excellent. Thank you both, Allison and Charlotte, for those answers. You're right. This is all tough, but you can see that this happens in real life in real time. And at some point we need to graduate from reading the material and actually putting of what we've learned into action. So I am going to let you guys breathe because I know that I have had you on the hot seat for a very long time. I want to thank you both, audience at home, wherever you're watching, to please thank Allison and Charlotte for joining me and being vulnerable during this exercise. Thank you also to the Boulder Public Library for the One Book One Boulder series. Thank you to the author of So You Want to Talk About Race, Ijeoma Oluo, for providing an accessible guide to help us talk about race in a way that graduates us from talking to action. I invite you all to think about the questions that we've explored tonight and decide for yourself how you will show up in real life situations to unapologetically advocate for marginalized people. Thank you so much for your attention and your participation with our volunteers. You can find me at all social media channels at McCord Consult, as well as the other methods listed on your screen. I believe that there are probably some questions that are coming up, and so I am going to look at my screen and look at some of these questions. So thank you so much for our volunteers for joining me today. So our first question is this. What if someone doesn't believe that they're racist, or they don't believe in implicit bias? I never looked at a resume and judged it on anything but merit. So the way that I'd answer that is there are definitely systems in place that have been established in this country that makes this country racist. They're underlying systems. And so they may not believe that they're racist, but just because they don't believe that they're racist doesn't mean that these systems don't exist. So one of the things that Charlotte brought up was mass incarceration, how it disproportionately impacts people of color, how we as a country went from slavery and then shortly after Reconstruction, we went right into mass incarceration. We can also talk about housing. We can talk about statistics when we see that Black homeowners are in no better shape than they were than in the 1960s due to redlining and predatory loans. So whether or not a person believes they're racist or not is one thing, but what is true and what does exist are the racist systems that were in place when this country began and are they're still in place today. And so that's how I would respond to people who say they may not be racist, but the systems and the way that we're taught and the way that we think have created a racist society in this country. Thank you for that question. Nikki, I appreciate how you continually push things up to the systemic level from the individual level. Can you share suggestions and techniques for us to try? Thank you so much for that question. Yes, and this is my own philosophy and my own personality. Like I said at the beginning, everyone is going to approach this work differently. But while I would love to change the hearts and minds of every person I come in contact with, I'm not always able to do that. And so what I do instead is try to work on the policies and procedures that are holding marginalized people and people of color back, and focus on that as well instead. And you can do that in your daily lives. You can do it in your workplace. You can do it in your places of worship. You can do it at your community centers and the places where you gather. It takes a lot of time to try to change a person's heart and mind. And what I tell people all the time is we're dying today. We're dying right now. And so I've run out of time to try to change the hearts and minds of every single person that I come in contact with. Instead, what are the systems that are holding us back? How can we change systems? Because when we change systems, they're actually going to be more equitable for everyone, and everyone's going to be on a more level playing field. So yes, my own personal belief in the way that I approach this work is not really the hearts and minds, but really, how can we change the policies and procedures to make our society more just and equitable? Thank you so much for that question. Can you recommend a local organization to support in this EDI work? That is a very good question. I know that locally, I love YWCAs because nationally, their charge is to eradicate racism. And so I always look to the YWCA as a great organization to get involved with. There are also organizations, there are Latino organizations in the Boulder area. There's the NAACP on the national level that I think is a great organization. There are Black Lives Matter movements. They're showing up for racial justice. Do a Google search. You can Google social justice in your town and find out ways to get involved. It's not so much a recommendation from me, but really you taking the time to investigate organizations on your own and finding organizations that line up with your point of view and the way that you like to approach this work. So I also like the Legal Defense Fund, which is founded by Thurgood Marshall and is an arm of the NAACP. So there are lots and lots of organizations out there. Show up, ask questions, and get involved in ways that make you feel comfortable, but then also push you a little out of your comfort zone as well.
Thank you, Nikki. We are waiting to see if some of our viewers have more questions. Friends, you're welcome to put questions on in the chat. Looks like we've got another one that's just come in. And I have a question while we're waiting for this question to be posted. Do you have a local organization that will help get out the vote for folks who might feel marginalized in our current political climate?
Let's see, a good local organization for get out the vote. I don't have a recommendation. And one of the reasons why I don't have a recommendation is because at least for marginalized communities or communities that I'm connected with, the idea of voting is not foreign. It's not something that at least the folks who I'm familiar with in marginalized communities have not been a part of. When you think about voting, especially with the Black community, we were killed because we dared to try to vote. And so I know that there are a lot of Black people specifically who take voting very seriously, who show up to election, whether it's a general election or a local election or a midterm election. So I don't have a recommendation. And that's one thing that I want to stress during this presentation as well. It's not so much about what does Nikki recommend, because I'm just one person. I'm one person just like the rest of you. It's really important for you to take the time to do some research to find out what is going to work best for you. It's all about trial and error. You may go to a meeting and find your community and find people that you really vibe with and you want to do this work. You may go to a meeting and say, oh, this isn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. I need to do some more research to find out what's going to be the best fit for me. So I'm one person. I don't know who asked that question. and I have my own ideas and opinions and the ways that I approach this work. And so I always recommend, Google is free. Put in a Google search, ask your friends what they recommend, and go from there.
Great. We have another question on the screen for you.
Excellent. Given how polarized news is these days, do you think that programs like living room conversations are effective? or another format to share articles with people on opposite sides of the spectrum. I'm hesitant to continue to share readings and share articles. If you joined us for this presentation, you can see that our wonderful volunteers, Allison and Charlotte, were caught off guard, and they didn't know how to react in certain situations that were very true to life. And so I'm a proponent of getting people outside their books. Don't be mad at me, Boulder Public Library, for saying that. But taking the time that after you read to have discussions. I'm also of the opinion that we can't save everyone. So figure out what work you're going to be able to do that's going to be most impactful to marginalized communities. Having a conversation back and forth among your friend or your relative or your coworker, how is that work going to actually do anything for a person of color? Is it going to make you feel good? Is it going to make you feel like you have the upper hand or that you're smarter or better than someone? Or is it going to really impact someone's life? I would rather you spend that time and energy figuring out how you're going to change a system, whether it's in your workplace, your place of worship, your social clubs. What are you going to do to make it an inclusive area for marginalized people and people of color, rather than having a philosophical debate? Because here's the thing, people are getting shot and killed in their homes, in their beds while they sleep. What is your philosophical conversation going to do to make sure that people are not shot in their beds multiple times while they are sleeping? I'm a person who believes in action, and I want to empower you to go from the comfort of the philosophical ideas of racism and unconscious bias and microaggressions and graduate to actually taking action that is going to positively impact the lives of marginalized populations. Next question. Do you recommend practicing scenarios like you presented tonight? If so, any tips for doing so with friends or family? Great question. I do recommend role-playing these situations. I think about it when I was coming up in the world and I was applying to jobs, and my dad would sit me down and he would pretend to be the employer and I would pretend to be the person looking for the job, and we would role play. We would go over every possible question that can be asked. And I'm sure a lot of you have done that as well. You've thought about, well, what is this interviewer going to ask me? How am I going to talk about myself in a great light? How am I going to answer this question? We have to do the same thing with these types of scenarios, because there's a population of people who have never been in these situations before. And so they don't know how to act and how to react. So I absolutely encourage you to practice with friends or family. In terms of tips for doing so, the very first thing is one of the norms that we talked about at the beginning of this session was have a growth mindset and to give grace. And so if you are going to go into this with a coworker or a friend or someone you trust, understand that you're going through these scenarios because you're both trying to grow, and you're going into the scenario understanding that you don't know everything. And the reason why you're going through these scenarios and this practicing so that you can get better at showing up. I said it at the very beginning. Racism shows up when you least expect it. You can be enjoying your day and all of a sudden you're either hit with a situation yourself or you're witness to a situation. And having a plan about how you will react in different situations will help you show up unapologetically to advocate for marginalized populations. Next question. Nikki, can you share a success a success story from your past work in these areas, whether you were involved or whether it was something you heard from someone else? I can. And this is a story that I love, love, love to share. So I was working with an organization, and we were going through unconscious bias training. And all of the examples that I was giving was related to race and ethnicity. And there was a gentleman in the discussion who seemed a little skeptical about all this DEI stuff. And he comes up to me at the very end of the session, and he says, Nikki, he said, I used to work at this company, and they called me old whitehead. He goes, and I didn't like that. He goes, because I was older than everybody else who worked in the organization. He said, was that a microaggression? He said, yeah, that was a microaggression. So sometimes it takes people sitting with information and seeing how it relates to their lives to understand that some of us have more similarities in dealing with these situations than we may think on the surface. You may hear the word unconscious bias, you may hear the word microaggressions and think, well, that doesn't apply to me because I'm a white male or I'm a cisgendered person. But we can find instances in our lives when we felt marginalized. And so taking that empathy to look at other people who are marginalized and relating it to your own life or experience is something very valuable. And I love telling that story because of the innocence of the question, the timidness, the aha moment when the light went off for this person to realize that microaggressions exist in lots of different forms, and that he had also been on the receiving end of a microaggression to help him better not commit those to people in his life in the future.
Thanks, Nikki. We've got one that's kind of close to home that's come through.
Okay.
Would you like me to read it? I want to read it.
Go ahead, Kathy.
So, and I'm going to echo this. Thank you, Nikki, for hosting this conversation. Any suggestions, and I would add, or challenges for how Boulder Public Library might be able to accelerate recruiting and retaining Black, Indigenous people of color to the library profession? I think it's a real knotty one, and it's something that looks at structural racism as well as personal.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I tell folks all the time is you can be inclusive without being diverse. So I caution folks from really trying to get diverse really quickly. Oh, we don't have a certain amount of these people. Let's add them to our organization and then we can say that we're diverse. Well, what happens when those people leave? What happens when you haven't created an environment that is going to be inclusive? They're going to get frustrated. They're going to get fed up. They're not going to have very good things to say about the organization, and they're going to leave. So you can do both at the same time. You can solve for diversity at the same time that you are also solving for inclusion or inclusivity. When we talk about inclusivity, we're talking about what's your culture. Lots of organizations will talk about what their culture is. Oh, you can bring your dog. We have Fridays off. We go rock climbing every Saturday. They can always explain their kind of community culture. Well, what's your culture as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion? What work have you undertaken? When it comes to recruiting people from marginalized communities, I always stress transparency because everyone is on a spectrum of what their tolerance is. You may recruit someone and say, hey, Nikki, listen, we really want you to join the library staff. We don't have a lot of Black people on staff. We've taken a few DEI trainings and all staff have gone through them, but we know that we have room to improve and we know that we're not perfect yet. Would you be comfortable joining our team knowing that information? That gives me a lot more information to go on rather than coming into a situation thinking it's going to be one way and then getting blindsided and seeing that it's another way. If you want to be inclusive after you diversify, I always tell people, you have to listen to the diverse people in the room. It's not so much to say that, well, Nikki's on staff now, and we're going to put her on all of our brochures and put her on the website, and we're going to say we're diverse. If, when I say, hey, Kathy, I've noticed that we haven't had any Indigenous authors speak at the library in 6 months. I really think that we should, take the time to make sure that we have Indigenous authors as speakers. And if Kathy comes and says, oh, yeah, Nikki, well, we don't have time for it now, or it's not in the budget, or we've already made the schedule, and, it's really not a good time to do that. You're not including me. You're not listening to those diverse voices. The reason why you asked me to join your organization is because you valued my voice. And if you're not going to value my voice, then don't invite me. When I talk about being transparent with people, and I said that we're all on a spectrum, there may be some people out there, some marginalized people who are like, you know what? I like it when people are starting out and trying new things. I'm going to be an explorer, an adventurer, and I'm going to be with the Boulder Public Library on this journey, and I'm going to show them where they're messing up. I'm going to help them with their mistakes. I'm going to be with them on this journey. There are other marginalized people who are like, nope, that's not my cup of tea. I don't want to have to do my job as a librarian or a custodian or a researcher or whatever my job is. I don't want to have to do that job as well as do the job of trying to usher you through your DEI journey. So I always encourage people to be transparent and work with people who are going to be a fit after being transparent with them.
Great, thank you. And we have more questions coming up. I'm going to take myself off stage as you continue to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Here's our next question. Sometimes it's difficult to respond right then and there when one witnesses microaggressions to others and oneself, especially in unexpected spaces. Words sometimes do not come fast enough. You are telling me. It's like anything, right? You're in a situation and it hits you. You're like, what do I do? And then you walk away and you're like, man, I could have had this retort. I could have had that retort. And you're like, if only I had the time. I think with racism, one of the things to remember is it's ever prevalent and it's always happening. It's always around us. And so to be prepared. Also, we're going to mess up. We're humans. Sometimes we're not on our best days. Sometimes we're thinking about, did we turn the stove off in the morning? And our mind is not sharp enough to respond to instances of racism or microaggressions. Remember that we're real people. Our lives are not movies. Our lives are not television shows. Everyone has a very quick retort on television, but that's just not the way that it works in real life. So you're going to need practice. You're going to mess up. You're going to need to give yourself grace when you mess up. But the most important thing is to learn from where you stumbled, to learn to do better the next time. Another thing that I would suggest is taking time to cool off. There's nothing wrong with taking a beat, breathing, and then approaching the situation again. If someone has hurt you, if someone has harmed you, you have every right to approach that person and let them know how they hurt and harm you, because it's not your responsibility to hold on to that. So I would encourage you to not judge yourself based upon other people, not judge yourself based upon what you see in movies and on television, but to be true to who you are authentically and how you show up in situations, to give yourself grace and to continue to try. Can I talk about the difference between equality and equity? I can. I have a great visual that is long to pull up. But when I think about equality, It means that everybody gets the same thing. So I get an apple, you get an apple, Kathy gets an apple, we all get one apple. That means that we're all equal, okay? But equity means that Kathy already has a hoard of apples. And so giving her one apple is not going to impact her life as much as giving me one apple who doesn't have a hoard of apples. So what is tricky about equity and what people get uncomfortable with equity is sometimes the what's the word I'm looking for? Sometimes the stepladder is higher for some people than it is for others, because that allows them to have equity. Because if we all can't access the same resources the same way, we can still get all of the same resources. That's equality. But if we're on different levels accessing those resources, then there's not equity. So equity makes a lot of people uncomfortable because it's saying that some people deserve a leg up more than others. But think about it this way. Think about college applications. Think about college. And we always talk about affirmative action. Oh, you only got here because you're Black, or you only got here because you're Hispanic, or whatever. Well, think about people who get accepted to college because their father went to that same college, or their uncle went to that same college, or their grandfather and their father and their uncle went to that same college. People don't think about equity matters in that way. And so not only do I like to talk about equality and equity and are and what they're not, and how uncomfortable it is for people to recognize that equity means that you have a leg up. It's an important distinction to make, and it's also very important to define these terms so that we are using them in the correct way as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Nikki. It looks like we may have reached the end of our questions from viewers. Do you have anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
I want to again thank our volunteers for being vulnerable and for showing up. I want to thank all of you for participating at home and asking your questions. Thank you also to the Boulder Public Library for putting on this series. Go get the book, read the book, use it as a resource. And I thank you to Ms. Oluo for writing this guide for us so that we can be ready and able to go from reading words on printed paper to acting in real life.
Great. Nikki, thank you so much for this opportunity to process conversations that we might have that we can take action on being anti-racist and challenge our own bias and that of those around us. Charlotte O'Donnell, Allison Gold, thank you for being our brave volunteers on screen. And Nikki, thank you for giving us an opportunity to build our own toolkits, our language, and techniques for addressing racism and being an anti-racist in the world. On the behind the scenes, thank you to Shannon Kincaid, Julianne Ingram, and Terja Becker for behind the scenes support. And I echo Nikki's thank you to all the participants. Thank you for your excellent questions, for being part of this deeper dive into examining questions from So You Want to Talk About Race with Nikki McCord. And I hope we are all inspired and feel more equipped to tackle difficult conversations with this attitude of anti-racism and commitment to being the change we wish to see in the world. I invite you all to join us next week in conversation with Ijeoma Oluo, author of So You Want to Talk About Race, and Asetu Zango on November 5th at 7 o'clock on both YouTube and Facebook Live. We invite you to complete a survey. It is something that's going to help us understand our community and how we can serve you better, as well as the impact of One Book One Boulder. Thank you, as Nikki said, thank you for the sponsorship of the Boulder Library Foundation, who supports 90% of Boulder Library programs and all of One Book One Boulder, I invite you to visit boulderlibraryfoundation.org to become a member. And I send you all off with appreciation of grace and gentleness and open minds and how we can support each other to make our world better together. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nikki.